The contemporary world is in the midst of a transformation in human consciousness so pervasive as to be nearly unnoticeable. This change, driven by new technologies which mediate our experience of the world and our acquisition of information, has developed largely without understanding of its long-term effects, including its implications for leadership. Under these conditions, reading a complex book carefully and engaging with it critically has become as countercultural an act as was memorizing an epic poem in the earlier print-based age. While the internet and its attendant innovations are unquestionably technical marvels, close attention must be paid to the balance between the constructive and corrosive habits of mind encouraged by new technology. Just as the earlier transition from oral to written culture at once yielded the benefits of literacy and diminished the arts of spoken poetry and storytelling, the contemporary shift from print to visual culture brings both losses and gains. What risks being lost in an age dominated by the image? The quality goes by many names: erudition, learnedness, serious and independent thinking, but the best term for it is deep literacy, defined by the essayist Adam Garfinkel as engaging with an extended piece of writing in such a way as to anticipate an author's direction and meaning. Ubiquitous and penetrating, yet invisible, deep literacy was the background radiation of the period in which the 6 leaders profiled in this book came of age. To the politically concerned, deep literacy supplies the quality Max Weber called proportion, or the ability to allow realities to impinge on you while maintaining an inner calm and composure. Intense reading can help leaders cultivate the mental distance from external stimuli and personalities that sustains a sense of proportion. When combined with reflection and the training of memory, it also provides a storehouse of detailed and granular knowledge from which leaders can reason analogically. More profoundly, books offer a reality that is reasonable, sequential and orderly, a reality that can be mastered, or at least managed, by reflection and planning. And, perhaps most importantly for leadership, reading creates a skein of intergenerational conversation, encouraging learning with a sense of perspective. Finally, reading is a source of inspiration. Books record the deeds of leaders who once dared greatly, as well as those who dared too much, as a warning. Well before the end of the 20th century, however, print had lost its former dominance. This resulted in, among other things, a different kind of person getting elected as leader, one who can present himself and his programs in a polished way, as Lee Kuan Yew observed in 2000, adding, "Just as the benefits of the printed era were inextricable from its costs, so it is with the visual age. With screens in every home, entertainment is omnipresent, and boredom, a rarity. More substantively, injustice visualized is more visceral than injustice described. Television played a crucial role in the American civil rights movement. Yet the costs of television are substantial, privileging emotional display over self-command, changing the kinds of people and arguments that are taken seriously in public life. The shift from print to visual culture continues with the contemporary entrenchment of the internet and social media, which bring with them 4 biases that make it more difficult for leaders to develop their capabilities than in the age of print. These are immediacy, intensity, polarity, and conformity. Although the internet makes news and data more immediately accessible than ever, this surfeit of information has hardly made us individually more becomes negligible. As with the internet, the incentives to remember it seem to weaken. While forgetting any one fact may not matter, the systematic failure to internalize information brings about a change in perception and a weakening of analytical ability. Facts are rarely self-explanatory. Their significance and interpretation depend on context and relevance. For information to be transmuted into something approaching wisdom, it must be placed within a broader context of history and experience. As a general rule, images speak at a more emotional register of intensity than do words. Television and social media rely on images that inflame the passions, threatening to overwhelm leadership with a combination of personal and mass emotion. Social media in particular have encouraged users to become image-conscious spin doctors. All this engenders a more populist politics that celebrates utterances perceived to be authentic over the polished sound bites of the television era, not to mention the more analytical output of print. The architects of the internet thought of their invention as an ingenious means of connecting the world. In reality, it has also yielded a new way to divide humanity into warring tribes. Polarity and conformity rely upon and reinforce each other. One is shunted into a group, and then the group polices one's thinking. Small wonder that on many contemporary social media platforms, users are divided into followers and influencers. There are no leaders. What are the consequences for leadership? In our present circumstances, Lee's gloomy assessment of visual media's effects is relevant. From such a process, I doubt if a Churchill, a Roosevelt, or a de Gaulle can emerge. It is not that changes in communications technology have made inspired leadership and deep thinking about world order impossible, but that in an age dominated by television and the internet, thoughtful leaders must struggle against the tide. UNDERLYINGVALUES. Today, merit tends to be understood narrowly as intellect compounded by effort. But Thomas Jefferson's earlier conception of a natural aristocracy rested on a different and perhaps more sustainable basis: the merging of virtue and talents. For a political elite to render meaningful public service, both education and character are essential. As we have seen, leaders with world historical impact have benefited from a rigorous and humanistic education. Such an education begins in a formal setting and continues for a lifetime through reading and discussion with others. That initial step is rarely taken today. Few universities offer an education in statecraft either explicitly or implicitly, and the lifelong effort is made more difficult as changes in technology erode deep literacy. Thus, for meritocracy to be reinvigorated, humanistic education would need to regain its significance, embracing such subjects as philosophy, politics, human geography, modern languages, history, economic thought, literature, and even perhaps classical antiquity, the study of which was long the nursery of statesmen. And since character is essential, a deeper conception of meritocratic leadership would also embrace the definition of virtue provided by the political scientist James Q. Wilson: habits of moderate action. More specifically, acting with due restraint on one's impulses, due regard for the rights of others, and reasonable concern for distant consequences. From youth to old age, the sheer centrality of character, that most indispensable of qualities, is an unending challenge, to leaders no less than to students of leadership. Good character does not assure worldly success or triumph in statecraft, but it does provide firm grounding in victory and consolation in failure. These 6 leaders will be remembered for the qualities that became associated with them, and that defined their impact. Adenauer for his integrity and persistence, de Gaulle for his determination and historical vision, Nixon for his comprehension of the interlocking international situation and his strength in decision, Sadat for the spiritual elevation with which he forged peace, Lee for his imagination in the founding of a new showed extraordinary courage. No single person could ever possess all these virtues at any one time. The 6 leaders combined them in different proportions. Their leadership became as identified with their attributes as with their achievements. LEADERSHIPNDWORLDORDER. Since the end of what these pages have described as the Second 30 Years' War, instantaneous communication and the technological revolution have combined to give a new significance and urgency to 2 crucial questions confronting leaders: what is imperative for national security? And what is required for peaceful international coexistence? These questions have been answered in different ways across history. Though a plethora of empires has existed, aspirations to world order were confined by geography as well as technology to specific regions. This was true even of the Roman and Chinese empires, which encompassed a vast range of societies and cultures within themselves. These were regional orders presenting themselves as world orders. Starting in the 16th century, an explosion in technology, medicine, and economic and political organization expanded the capacity of the West to project its power and systems of governance around the world. From the middle of the 17th century, the Westphalian system based on respect for sovereignty and international law developed within Europe. That system, which became embedded worldwide after the end of colonialism, allowed the rise of states which, shedding Western dominance, insisted on their part in defining, and sometimes challenging, the rules of the established world order. In his essay Perpetual Peace, the philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote 3 centuries ago that mankind was destined for universal peace either by way of human insight or by conflicts of a magnitude and destructiveness that would leave no alternative. The prospects stated were too absolute. The problem of international order has not appeared as an either/or proposition. For all of recent memory, mankind has lived with a balance between relative security and legitimacy established by its leaders and interpreted by them. At no previous period in history have the consequences of getting this balance wrong been more fraught or catastrophic. The contemporary age introduced a level of destructiveness which has enabled mankind to destroy civilization itself. This is reflected in the period's established grand strategies, famously abbreviated and conceptualized in the phrase mutual assured destruction, MAD. These were advanced in pursuit not so much of traditional victory as of war's prevention, and ostensibly designed less for conflict, understood to be potentially suicidal, than for deterrence. Not long after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the risks of fielding of nuclear weapons became incalculable, the stakes disconnected from the consequences. For more than 7 decades, while advanced weapons have grown in power, complexity, and accuracy, no country has persuaded itself actually to use them, even in conflict with non-nuclear countries. As previously described, both the Soviet Union and the United States accepted defeat at the hands of non-nuclear countries without resorting to their own deadliest weapons. These dilemmas of nuclear strategy have never disappeared. They have instead mutated as more states have developed advanced weapons, and as the essentially bipolar Cold War distribution of destructive capacities has been replaced by a more complicated and potentially less stable kaleidoscope of high-tech options. Cyber weapons and AI applications, such as autonomous weapon systems, exacerbate the existing range of dangers. Unlike nuclear weapons, cyber weapons and artificial intelligence are ubiquitous, relatively inexpensive to develop and tempting to use. Cyber weapons combine the capacity for massive impact with the possibility of obscuring the attribution of attacks. Artificial intelligence is able to overcome even the need for human operators, instead allowing weapons to launch themselves based on their own calculations and their ability to choose targets with near absolute destructive capacity so great, resorting to such weapons, or even their formal threat, may turn a crisis into a war or transform a limited war into a nuclear one through unintended or uncontrollable escalation. The impact of revolutionary technology makes the full application of these weapons cataclysmic while rendering their limited use difficult to the point of unmanageability. No diplomacy has yet been invented for threatening their use explicitly without the risk of preemption in reply. Arms control explorations seem to have been dwarfed by these enormities. It has been a paradox of the age of high technology that actual military operations have been confined to conventional weapons or tactical deployment of small-scale high-tech weapons, from drone strikes to cyber attacks. At the same time, advanced weapons are expected to be contained by mutual assured destruction. This pattern is too precarious for the long-term future. History remains a relentless taskmaster as the technological revolution has been accompanied by a political transformation. At this writing, the world is witnessing the return of great power rivalry, magnified by the spread and advancement of astonishing technologies. When in the early 1970s China embarked upon its re-entry into the international system, its human and economic potential was vast, but its technology and actual power were comparatively limited. China's rising economic and strategic capacities have meanwhile obliged the United States to contend for the first time in its history with a geopolitical competitor whose resources are potentially comparable to its own, a task as unfamiliar to Washington as to Beijing, which historically has treated foreign nations as tributaries to Chinese power and culture. Each side thinks of itself as exceptional, but differently. The United States acts on the premise that its values are universally applicable and will ultimately be adopted everywhere. China expects that its civilizational uniqueness and impressive economic performance will inspire other societies to show deference to its priorities. Both the United States' missionary impulse and China's sense of cultural eminence imply a kind of technology each nation is impinging, partly by momentum, importantly by design, on what the other has heretofore considered its core interests. China in the 21st century seems embarked on an international role to which it thinks itself entitled by its achievements over millennia. The United States is acting to project power, purpose and diplomacy around the world to maintain a global equilibrium rooted in its post-war experience, responding to tangible and conceptual challenges to that order. For the leaders of each side, these requirements of security seem self-evident, and they are supported by public opinion. Yet security is only part of the equation. The key issue for the future of the world is whether the two behemoths can learn to combine inevitable strategic rivalry with a concept and practice of coexistence. As for Russia, it conspicuously lacks China's market power, demographic heft, and diversified industrial base. Spanning 11 time zones and enjoying few natural defensive demarcations, Russia has acted according to its own geographical and historical imperatives. Russian foreign policy transforms a mystical patriotism into imperial entitlement, with an abiding perception of insecurity essentially derived from the country's long-standing vulnerability to invasion across the East European plain. For centuries, its authoritarian leaders have tried to insulate Russia's vast territory with a security belt imposed around its diffuse border. Today, the same priority manifests itself, once again, in the attack on Ukraine. The impact of these societies on each other has been shaped by their strategic assessments, which grow out of their histories. The Ukrainian conflict illustrates this. After the disintegration of the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe and their emergence as independent nations, the entire territory from the established security line in the center of Europe to the national border of Russia became open for a new strategic design. Stability depended on whether the emerging dispensation could calm historic European fears of Russian domination, as well as account for traditional Russian concern over offensives from the West. The strategic geography of Ukraine epitomizes these concerns. It would be placed within 300 miles of Moscow, in effect eliminating the historic buffer which saved Russia when France and Germany sought to occupy it in successive centuries. If the security border were to be established on the western side of Ukraine, Russian forces would be within striking distance of Budapest and Warsaw. The February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, in flagrant violation of international law, is thus largely an outgrowth of a failed strategic dialogue, or else of an inadequately undertaken one. The experience of two nuclear entities confronting each other militarily, even while not having recourse to their ultimate weapons, underlines the urgency of the fundamental problem. The triangular relationship between America, China, and Russia will eventually resume, though Russia will be weakened by the demonstration of its military limits in Ukraine, the widespread rejection of its conduct, and the scope and impact of the sanctions against it. But it will retain nuclear and cyber capabilities for doomsday scenarios. In US-China relations, the conundrum is whether two different concepts of national greatness can learn to coexist peacefully side by side, and how. With Russia, the challenge is whether that country can reconcile its view of itself with the self-determination and security of the countries in what it has long defined as its near abroad, mostly in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, and to do so as part of an international system rather than by means of domination. It now seems possible that a liberal and universal rules-based order, however worthy in its conception, will be replaced in practice for an indeterminate period of time by an at least partially decoupled world. Such a division encourages a quest at its fringes for spheres of influence. If so, how will countries that do not agree on rules of global conduct be able to operate within an agreed design of equilibrium? Will the quest for dominance overwhelm the analysis of coexistence? In a world of increasingly formidable technology that can either uplift or dismantle human civilization, there is no final resolution, not to speak of a military one, to great power competition. An unrestrained technological convinced of the malevolent intent of the other risks creating a cataclysmic cycle of mutual suspicion like that which started the First World War, but with incomparably greater consequences. All sides are thus now obliged to re-examine their first principles of international behavior and relate them to the possibilities of coexistence. For the leaders of high-tech societies in particular, there is a moral and strategic imperative to carry out, both within their own and with potential adversarial countries, a permanent discussion of the implications of technology and of how its military applications might be restrained. The subject is too important to neglect until crises arise. As with the arms control dialogues that helped contribute to restraint during the nuclear age, high-level explorations of the consequences of emerging technologies could cultivate reflection and promote habits of reciprocal strategic self-control. An irony of the contemporary world is that one of its glories, the revolutionary explosion of technology, has emerged so quickly, and with such optimism, that it has outrun thought of its perils, and inadequate systematic efforts have been made to understand its capacities. Technologists develop astonishing devices, but they have had little occasion to explore and assess their comparative implications within a frame of history. Political leaders too often lack an adequate grasp of the strategic and philosophical implications of the machines and algorithms at their disposal. At the same time, the technological revolution is impinging on human consciousness and perceptions of the nature of reality. The last great comparable transformation, the Enlightenment, replaced the age of faith with repeatable experiments and logical deductions. It is now being supplanted by reliance on algorithms, which work in the opposite direction, offering outcomes in search of an explanation. Exploring these new frontiers will require a committed effort from leaders to narrow, and ideally to close, existing gaps between the worlds of technology, politics, history, and philosophy. In the first chapter of these pages, the test of leadership was described as the capacity for analysis, strategy, courage, and character. The challenge is contemporary ones, if less far-ranging. The criterion by which to judge the leader in history remains unchanged: to transcend circumstance by vision and dedication. It is not necessary for the leaders of the contemporary great powers to develop a detailed vision of how to resolve the dilemmas described here immediately. They must, however, be clear on what has to be avoided and cannot be tolerated. Wise leaders must preempt their challenges before they manifest themselves as crises. Lacking a moral and strategic vision, the present age is unmoored. The vastness of our future as yet defies comprehension. The increasingly acute and disorienting steepness of the crests, the depths of the troughs, the dangers of the shoals, all these demand navigators with the creativity and fortitude to guide societies to as yet unknown, but more hopeful destinations. THFUTUREOFLEADERSHIP. The two questions Konrad Adenauer put to me during our final meeting in 1967, 3 months before his death, have gained new relevance. Are any leaders still able to conduct a genuine long-range policy? Is true leadership still possible today? After exploring the lives of 6 consequential 20th-century figures and the conditions that enabled their achievements, the student of leadership naturally wonders whether parallel performances can be replicated. Are leaders coming forth with the character, intellect, and hardiness required to meet the challenges facing world order? The question has been asked before, and leaders have emerged who rose to the occasion. When Adenauer posed his questions, Sadat, Lee, and Thatcher were largely unknown. Likewise, few who witnessed the fall of France in 1940 could imagine its renewal under de Gaulle in a career spanning 3 decades. When Nixon opened the dialogue with China, few contemporaries had an inkling of its possible consequences. Machiavelli, in his Discourses on Livy, ascribes the slackening of leadership to social lassitude induced by long periods of tranquility. When societies are blessed with peaceful times and indulge the slow corruption of standards, the people may follow, either a man who is judged to be good by common self-deception, or someone put forward by men who are more likely to desire special favors than the common good. But later, under the impact of adverse times, ever the teacher of realities, this deception is revealed, and out of necessity the people turn to those who in tranquil times were almost forgotten. The grave conditions described here must, in the end, provide the impetus for societies to insist on meaningful leadership. In the late 19th century, Friedrich Engels predicted that the government of persons would be replaced by the administration of things. But greatness in history resides in the refusal to abdicate to vast impersonal forces. Its defining elements are, and must continue to be, created by human beings. Max Weber has described the essential qualities needed for transformative leadership. The 6 leaders discussed here developed parallel qualities despite the profound differences among their societies. A capacity to understand the situation in which their societies found themselves, an ability to devise a strategy to manage the present and shape the future, a skill in moving their societies toward elevated purposes, and a readiness to rectify shortcomings. Faith in the future was to them indispensable. It remains so. No society can remain great if it loses faith in itself, or if it systematically impugns its self-perception. This imposes above all the willingness to enlarge the sphere of concern from the self to the society at large, and to evoke the generosity of public spirit which inspires sacrifice and service. Great leadership results from the collision of the intangible and the malleable, from that which is given and that which is exerted. Scope remains for individual effort to deepen historical understanding, hone strategy, and improve character. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus wrote long ago, "We cannot choose our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them." It is the role of leaders to help guide that choice and inspire their people in its execution.